Hi everyone, this is Fr Harrison Ayre again with our next talk for Theology Body. I have to record this on a Sunday morning, so if you hear organ in the background or a bit of church noises, that's why. Also, I know the angle's just a tad bit off. I have someone who's going to help me look at the camera stuff a little bit later today, but I just thought you should know that. And so we will get started with our next talk. So today we're going to talk about the beginning still. We're still in the context of the beginning. And today we're going to look at the first creation account. And so first, let's just do a brief review over what we talked about last week. So last week, we looked at Jesus' encounter with the Pharisees and their debate about the meaning of marriage, and more fundamentally, what it means to be human. We will recall that by quoting the text from Genesis and by referring to the beginning, Jesus is imbuing this text with a new authority. Finally, we will also recall that our own beginning, the fact that we are creatures, finds a certain remaining resonance with this text, that the text of Genesis in many ways unpacks our own fundamental experience of being creatures. We're going to use a bit more technical terms today, and so I want to define a few terms just in case you're not familiar with them. These are generic definitions. They're not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of the word, but just so you have a sense of what we mean when we hear this word. And the first one is anthropology. So anthropology is the study of man. In North America, we see this more as cultural anthropology. But when we use it in theology or philosophy, we mean it in a much broader sense. The study of man in his whole humanity as male, female, social, individual, body, soul, etc. The next word is metaphysics. Meta means to be above, and physics, the material world. For our purposes, it is sufficient to say that metaphysics is a discipline of philosophy, whereby we study the essence or nature of things. It also studies being. That is, everything that exists has the character of existing. What is that? We want to understand what existing itself means. It also looks at things like the transcendentals of truth, beauty, and goodness, and many other things. Finally, we want to look at the word cosmology, and it's simply the study of the cosmos, the universe. Cosmology, or the cosmological, is not a different word for astronomy or astrophysics. It is, in a way, something like an in-between of astronomy and metaphysics. It looks at the grand meaning of the universe, but not merely in its physical and biological aspects, but also at what being a creature in the midst of the universe means for both us and the universe. So now we're about to get into a more detailed analysis of the book of Genesis, it is important to point out briefly a couple principles of biblical interpretation that help us understand what John Paul II is doing when he approaches the book of Genesis. This is vital because we don't understand how to read the Bible today in the lens of the church. And so the first one I want to look at is called canonical interpretation. That is perhaps the most important principle when reading the Bible. It is, yes, a collection of individual books, the Bible is. But there is a whole to it, salvation history, centered around the person of Jesus Christ. Christ is the one whom the Old Testament points towards, who is revealed in the New Testament, and is the one to whom all of us and all creation are oriented towards with the final redemption. The Bible is meant to be read as a unity of texts in their diverse genres, styles, etc. The second one, and this is going to be a little bit longer, is what I want to call the sacramental approach to Scripture. So ours is an age of literalism, and by this I mean that we have a vision of language and life that wants its plain sense devoid of mystery. But for language to be language, it must communicate meaning. But for us today, the meaning is no longer the mystery of the something more. A book for me, for example, is not just a collection of pages with a cover written by someone else who wants to convey certain content. But for me, it's also an adventure, an exhilarating pursuit of truth, for example. Thus, what is the something more that language communicates, its poetic sense, is lost. And nowadays, the words must bear the full weight of meaning itself. An analogy might help us understand what I mean by this. Imagine you're pulling a 200-pound weight with a levy system. The levy allows you to pull something more than you could directly. But if you took away the ropes and the whole levy system and just had the weight, you would probably be unable to pull it. It's similar with language. When language loses the levy, that is, the fact that it is meant to be a sign that points to something more, then it bears something that is too heavy for it. It is why our culture, for example, is very litigious. We are pulling the weight of meaning with our words, and we expect our words to bear something they cannot. And the second we say the wrong thing or are not sufficiently nuanced, we are looked upon with suspicion. This brings us to the biblical text. When we talk about the literal sense of Scripture today, we may not realize how much we have been formed by this contemporary view of language. Thus, when we talk about the literal sense of Genesis, we begin to say things like, well, if it's literal, then it means God literally created. God only actually created in 7 days. This notion is in fact quite modern and does not have much of a tradition at all in Israel, the early church, or the medieval church. It is truly a modern innovation to look at the literal sense of Scripture in this way. When the church speaks of the literal sense, she is presuming a symbolic vision of language. What I said earlier is that poetic sense. That means there is meaning meant to be conveyed through the words of the text, according to its genre, style, history, etc. The 7 days of creation, then, for example, when interpreted literally with the mind of the church, is not 7 days in a strict sense. Rather, the number 7 has a meaning in both the ancient world and in Israel, that it has a real and deep abiding connection with the Sabbath, that the ascending character of creation from the more base and material to the more spiritual, culminating in the creation of man, is meant to demonstrate how all of creation relates to each other, etc. This literal sense opens to the spiritual sense of Scripture, that the meaning conveyed through the text can have an infinite amount of applications to the life of the church. So again, for example, the church fathers would see in the creation of Eve, from the side of Adam, a symbol of the church which flows from the side of Christ on the cross. Or how the 7 sacraments are have an apt connection with the 7 days of creation, etc. Remember, sacrament means the spiritual is made known and present and effective in and through the material. This applies both in the literal sense as such, and the spiritual sense the literal is meant to reveal. Entering into John Paul II's catechesis now more directly, he draws us to this more detailed analysis of the beginning, this time focusing on the creation account that begins in Genesis chapter 1. And yes, there are actually 2 creation accounts here. The first one is the more kind of bird's eye view, what we would call the cosmological. And the close-up of creation, the second one that begins in chapter 2 of Genesis, is the more anthropological view. Both are important and meant to convey from different angles the truth revealed in the one act of creation. The purpose of the first creation account is to formulate the essential truths about the whole of creation, and for our purposes in these catecheses from John Paul II, is to establish the essential truths about what it means to be human. Because man is created within the rhythm of the 7 days, we see the cosmic nature of humanity. That is to say, man as male and female is the means by which the whole of creation is meant to be understood. Humanity is the lens through which we read the book of creation, and creation itself exists for humanity. But remember that cosmological is not just the material stuff of the universe. It is also its deeper meaning, its spiritual principle as well. Man created within the visible world is not referred to with the rest of the creatures, but rather, as the text reveals to us, is identified by his being made in the image and likeness of God. Cross-reference Genesis 1:27. He emerges in the context of the 7 days, is fruitful and multiplies like the animals, but only in the context of man does God call this creature his image and likeness. thereby conveying a deep spiritual truth, and that they also stand, if you will, above the material created order. Not only is man made in God's image and likeness, but this sudden interruption of the rhythm of the 7 days, and here I want to quote John Paul II directly. He says that the Creator seems to halt before calling man into existence, as if God entered back into himself to make a decision. Let us make man in our image, in our likeness. The other thing noted in a footnote by John Paul II is that while both animals and human beings are given the same command to be fruitful and multiply, thereby indicating their bodily nature as creatures as essential to who they are, it is only in reference to man that God calls them male and female. Clearly, this is a property for the animals as well. We know this from biology. But the fact it is only referenced in the creation of man demonstrates that they do not exist only for the multiplication of the species, but also to create a communion of persons in their love. The difference of male and female is a personal principle that is also a spiritual principle revealed through the body. One can only be male and female, as we will come to see, because their sex, as male or female, is experienced subjectively as man and woman. The text, therefore, is stating that this biological difference has a deeper meaning for the human being, in part because of the fact that man is made in God's image and likeness as male and female. John Paul continues by saying that this creation account reveals that man has a theological character. In other words, by virtue of the fact God creates man in his image and likeness, means that we can, through studying the human person, understand something about who God is himself. At the same time, man is not fully understood unless in the light of God who made him. What we see is what is essential to man. He is both spirit and body. You cannot have a humanity without both, and they reveal to us our spiritual character with God and our bodily creature with the rest of character with the rest of creation. Finally, John Paul says that this theological character of man also reveals metaphysical content about being. It is this text, he argues, that becomes foundational for the Western philosophical tradition of the relationship between being, what something is, and existence, the particular historical instantiation of the thing. I am, for example, Fr Harrison, a human being. I have everything of what it means to be human, but I'm only one instance of humanity. I'm not at the same time its whole, even though I bear the whole. The fact that man's being, he comes from God and has his root in God, is lived out in perpetuity, to be by virtue of being fruitful and multiplying, is a great expression of this great metaphysical question. How we are as beings, what our nature is, and how we exist. Thus we see clearly we are a being, we are contingent. That is, we are dependent, we are creatures. We are not the creators of ourselves. In this, the fact that we exist, our beings in this world, we share in the affirmation of God in the creation text. God saw that it was very good. To exist is good. These are, for John Paul II and the Western tradition, interchangeable concepts. Thus, my embodiedness and my spiritual nature, having a body, is part of my creatureliness. And insofar as I embrace this, I find that it is good that I exist. This will have big implications for theology, anthropology, metaphysics, and more particular, an investigation into a theology of the body itself. So, points to remember. We are meant to read Scripture as a whole and with a sacramental lens. Secondly, the two accounts of creation speak of the one-act creation from different angles. Third, to be human reveals to us that we are material beings. We are created in the same rhythm as the 7 days, but we are also spiritual beings. We are made in God's image and likeness and therefore transcend the rest of creation as well. We live in between these two spheres, if you will, as male and female. Male and female is only mentioned in regards to humanity in the context of being made in God's image and likeness. By studying what man is as image and likeness of God, we can get profound insights into who God is. And finally, our last review point is to exist is good. So one extra point, because this one went a bit longer than I had originally expected. To exist is good, as I said in that last review point. This is a counterfactual in our age. In the age of kind of brooding music and literary and popular figures where nihilism is seen as a virtue, this is perhaps a truth that may almost seem like a no-brainer on the surface to us as Christians, but in the context of our current cultural climate, demonstrates the radical character of revelation. To be a creature is good. To be limited is good. To not be able to do all things is good. To have weaknesses is good. If you sin, you still have goodness, because sin cannot destroy what God creates. But if to exist is good, and I am a creature, and not the bearer of my own life and meaning, then the question of who created me becomes one of the most foundational questions. Thus, when the world becomes nihilistic, when the notion of self-creation comes to the fore, we actually at the same time lose with that the goodness of our existence. Goodness is only a possible thing to affirm of existing if we are creatures, because it means we exist by virtue of someone who is greater than we are, and who gives us something from the beginning we cannot achieve on our own, that we are gifted into existence. Only in a worldview governed by the doctrine of creation and the fact of a creator God can one reasonably say to exist is good. A world that loses this loses the goodness of their own existence and being, and ceases to see that existence as a gift, and that to see that existence is good. Only in being a creature can I say it is good that I exist. There is no other way. This is part of the biblical revolution, and we will look at this more in context next week with the second creation account. And as we were finishing there, I want to just maybe add one thing I did not actually add on Tuesday nights, so here's a little bonus content for our YouTube viewers, is when we lose this fact of our createdness, we actually also lose the importance of biological difference. Only when we can see that we are creatures and that to be creature is limited, can we accept the limitation that I am only male or I am only female. To lose this, we lose these distinctions when we actually lose the fact that we are creatures, when we lose the fact that we are limited. We are imbued with an idea today that freedom, it can do what you want, when you want, how you want. How often do we hear, well, you can be whatever you want when you grow up, as long as you put your mind to it. But we know that's not true deep down. There are limitations and barriers in life that can interfere with our ability to achieve our goals even sometimes. It's not to say we shouldn't chase these goals, but this is a fact. These statements of you can do whatever, you can be whatever you want are subtle. They are subtle visions of the problem of a loss of our creatureliness. To be limited is to be good. It is only by being limited that I can actually see my value. When I create my own self, when my freedom is the only thing that determines my value, then I lose the sense of value when I cannot create what I want. And in the end, all these things lose their value because they're not oriented and rightly ordered and related with the God who gives us our freedom, and in whose freedom we actually have our freedom. So these are some of the modern problems we're dealing with. They are the underlying intellectual bedrock, if you will, of a lot of the ideologies that are emerging in our age and have emerged in the past and will emerge in different ways in the future. Personally, this is why I don't worry too much about the various ideological trends, because they tend to change every 2 or 3 years. And we are doing a disservice to the church and the world when we only focus on reactive responses to what is in front of us right away, instead of seeing the deeper things of creation in the world. And so this is why one of the reasons I want to do these catecheses is John Paul II offers us this deeper vision. And this is why I'm also doing it only weekly. We need to be able to sit with this content. Sometimes I will not be as good at summarizing it as other weeks. For example, this week was very rushed, and I kind of had to put it together quickly, and it was not as polished as I wanted it to be, but that's okay. Again, I'm a limited human being myself, and I have to accept that. But the idea is that we can journey together, struggle through this together, and come to learn what the deep biblical revolution of who it is who creates us, to understand him, and to understand ourselves in light of him. This is when we understand this, then we're getting to the core of everything. And we are able to anew go boldly forth with the proclamation of the Christian faith, and united with it a new humanism that emboldens and empowers the radical distinctiveness of male and female in an authentic human way. So God bless you, and we will see you in the coming week.